Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. So I want to talk about 12 Sunnas of intimacy, 12 Sunnas of intimacy as laid out by Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, who was, may Allah have mercy on his soul, who was a student of Imam al-Ghazali. He was a Maliki scholar, a jurist, a judge. That's why it's called Qadi. He was from Andalusia in Islamic Spain. He wrote a number of books. One of the books that he wrote was called Ahkam al-Jima, meaning the rulings pertaining to sexual intimacy. Ahkam al-Jima. Ahkam is a plural of hakam, and Jima means sexual intercourse. So he wrote this book in which he laid out um, the rulings in terms of when sexual intercourse is prohibited and with who. Then he also laid out the Sunnas or the recommended acts in relation to sexual intimacy. And then he also laid out the etiquettes, the adab in relation to sexual intimacy. And a couple of hundred years later, one of Imam Asyuti, so Imam Asyuti was a scholar, an Egyptian scholar from the 15th century. One of his students called Ashadili, who was also a Maliki scholar, he did a commentary of Ibn al-Arabi's book, which I'm going to talk about. And in his book, I think his book was called Tashnif al-Asma bi Shar' Ahkam al-Jima'. And his book, it's in Arabic. I think some parts have been translated into, no, I don't think it's been translated into English as of yet, but he did a commentary of that book, breaking down the different duties, recommended acts and etiquettes in relation to sexual intimacy as laid out by Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi. But for this purpose of this video, I want to talk about the 12 sunans, or the 12 recommended acts in relation to intimacy, because again, this wasn't a controversial topic for the pre-modern medieval Muslim scholars. They spoke very candidly about sex, intimacy, women's pleasure, and a lot of the books were written directed at men to ensure that their female partners, their lawful female partners, whether they were their wives or female slaves, to ensure that they were sexually satisfied, because it was considered as part of a Muslim's duty, a Muslim man's duty, to ensure that your wife is sexually satisfied in the bedroom. And they studied other traditions like the ancient Indians, Kama Sutra. They studied ancient Greeks. There's philosophers and scholars about intimacy, male-female relations. And then they wrote their own book based on their understanding of the Quran and the Hadith of our blessed Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So, yeah, I'm just going to talk about the 12 Sunnas, or the 12 recommended acts, which Abu Bakr ibn Arabi laid out, and he died on 1148, so the 12th century of the Common Era. So the first sunnah, the first recommended act is to say a prayer before intercourse. The second is to engage in foreplay. The third is to sexually satisfy the woman, i.e., female orgasm. The fourth is to avoid facing the qibla during intimacy. The fifth is to avoid being completely naked whilst making love. The sixth is to avoid looking at the genitals. The seventh is to clean oneself, especially obviously the private area after intercourse. The eighth is to avoid having intercourse with a breastfeeding woman, i.e., while she's breastfeeding. The ninth is to avoid excessive talk. The 10th is to recite a prayer after ejaculation, after intercourse. The 11th is to perform the ritual wash, i.e., ghusl after intercourse. And the 12th is to not enter the night suddenly, especially if you've been away on a trip or you've been absent. And this is obviously related to speaking to men. So these are the 12 sunnahs or the 12 recommended acts in relation to intimacy, which Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi laid out. And I'm going to kind of explain each of them. So the first one, like I said, was the prayer before sex, and that is to say the basmalah, to say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the most beneficent, most merciful. And there's different variations or different, slightly longer prayers that he laid out, but ultimately it's to say, to recite the basmalah, to say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the most beneficent, most merciful. There's other hadiths which talk about certain dua that one could say to ask Allah, seek refuge in Allah from the devil, from shaitan, or ask Allah for protection before you before you penetrate your wife, before penetration. So there are different variations of this hadith of the prayer. But ultimately, the first recommended act for intercourse is to say a prayer before one penetrates one's wife. Number two is foreplay. So when he was speaking about foreplay in Arabic, it's mula'aba, inaq, and taqbil. So what he spoke about is before you have intercourse with your wife, you should engage in mula'aba, which is playfulness, foreplay, like with your wife, inaq, which is hugging, embracing her, cuddling, taqbil, which is to engage in kissing, and to not be hasty in terms of going for penetration. So it's to ensure that your wife is mentally as well as physically ready before entering penetration. And there are a number of hadiths rated by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, telling men not to behave like an animal or wild beast during the encounter, that you should send sweet kisses of sweet words and kisses before penetration to ensure that the wife is physically and psychologically ready for intimacy. So this is the Prophet teaching men to prioritize women's pleasure and to ensure that before you're thinking about penetration, you should ensure that she is in the right state of mind. Obviously, you have consent, and then she feels good about herself and she's ready to receive you. So the second recommended act, like I mentioned, is to engage in foreplay, a lot of foreplay. Number three is female orgasm, to ensure that your wife is sexually satisfied. And he mentions that the man should strive to ensure that his wife is sexually fulfilled. So he should strive to ensure that his wife is sexually fulfilled. And this obviously means that it's alluding to ensuring that she has an orgasm or she reaches climax. Now, again, not every woman needs to have an orgasm, but again, if it's something that woman needs, then you should strive to ensure that she reaches an orgasm or she has a climax or she experiences female ejaculation, which is some of what some scholars have spoken about. But ultimately, is to ensure that she is fulfilled before you finish the encounter. And there's a hadith that speaks about that when you're intimate with your wife, you should strive to satisfy her and you should not leave her until she has also been satisfied the same way you would like to be satisfied. So this is again the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the scholars were teaching and encouraging men not to be selfish in the bedroom, to prioritize their wife's pleasure and to ensure that she is fulfilled just as much or just like how you would like to be fulfilled. So again, to be a Muslim man, a good Muslim man, is not to be selfish, is one who's not selfish in the bedroom. The fourth sunnah that, or the fourth recommended act is to avoid the qibla. And what he said is that when one is intimate, one shouldn't face the direction of the sacred mosque in Mecca, i.e. the Kaaba. Now, this particular recommended act, this is based on either some reports or some hadith, but the hadith itself, I don't think is, I believe it's not authentic, or some reports that what some scholars say is of good manners. It's not that you have to, but they just said out of like etiquette and courtesy that one shouldn't face the qibla whilst they're making love. It's not to say that it's haram, but they're just encouraging that one should avoid facing the qibla. And number five is to avoid naked sex. So to refrain from being completely naked when having sex. I just want to explain the context of this particular piece of advice. This might have been, there are some traditions that they're not authentic, but there are some traditions that say that one shouldn't be naked with their spouse like two donkeys. And there are also some scholars of the past who also said that at least maybe should have a cover over yourself, over your wife whilst you're making love. Now, a number of these hadiths that speak about or naked sex being something that's wrong or prohibited or something that's discouraged, this these are based on reports that are not authentic and they're not authentically attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, because during the time of Imam Malik, some people in Kufa in Iraq was saying this, some of the scholars and preachers, and then someone went to Imam Malik in Medina and asked him, "Can I make love to my wife whilst I'm naked?" And he said it's completely fine. So he refuted this idea that avoid sleeping with your wife naked is something which is discouraged or disapproved. So again, according to Imam Malik, there's no issue with sleeping with your wife naked. And also, it also may be the case of the reason why Qadi Abu Bakr, Ibn al-Arabi said this was because there are some scholars who discouraged being completely naked. And also, you have to remember in those times, in those days, their houses sometimes the windows people could see through and things like that. So maybe it was a case of trying to protect the privacy of the man and his wife, just in case someone like walked past, maybe looked through their window. And Allah knows best, but that's the fifth reason or fifth recommended act that he gave. But I wouldn't necessarily say that there is any strong, authentic hadith that supports this. But it might have been something that at the time it was kind of seen as discouraged to sleep naked because again, potentially someone could walk past one's house and see that person naked. Whereas nowadays, I think that's quite unlikely. The sixth recommended act is to avoid genital looking. Now, this is again, it's a controversial issue. It's one that many of the scholars spoke about, where there are a number of hadiths and reports, but these hadiths are not authentic, where the Prophet is reported to have said that do not look at a woman's genitalia, i.e., her vulva, her vagina, when making love, because it can cause blindness. Now, that hadith is not authentic, it's fabricated, but a number of scholars do narrate it. Ibn al-Arabi, does talk about it and discusses it. And there are a number of Maliki scholars who refuted it, such as Imam al-Qurtubi. He said that there's no, like, he was looking at the different scholars who said that, are you allowed to look at the genitalia or not? And then he quoted Asbagh, who was Ibn Farj, who was an early Maliki scholar who said that it's perfectly permissible to look at the wife's genitalia. A man can even lick her clitoris or he can lick her vagina, he said. So he was refuting this idea that to you can't look at a woman's genitalia. And there is a report where Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, is reported to have said that the Prophet didn't look at her genitals and he didn't look at her genitals. And what scholars have concluded is that that is maybe out of etiquette or out of shyness, but it's not something that it is prohibited. So because it's not prohibited, that is why Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi he put it down as one of the recommended acts that to avoid genital looking. But again, like I said, there's some scholars who say it's perfectly fine. But this was the sixth recommended act that he laid out to avoid staring at the genitalia. لا ينظر إلى فرج مرأة in al-Jima. Okay, number seven, to clean oneself after intercourse. To clean oneself after intercourse. And Ibn al-Arabi, he said one should use a cloth or like a handkerchief to clean one's private parts after ejaculation. And there is a report which he cited, but I'm not, authenticity of this report is not actually sound. But what you find is a number of scholars, if they found a hadith, if it was not like sound, if it wasn't authentic, but there was some weakness in it, they still might rely on it and use it for recommended acts because the Prophet may have said it. So with a hadith that's weak, like da'if, it doesn't necessarily mean the Prophet did not say it categorically, but he may have said it. And some scholars, if a hadith is weak, they might like disregard it altogether, but other scholars still use it in their books of not only books of law, but also their books of etiquette and adab. So the seventh recommended act of sunnah is to clean oneself after intercourse and to have like a handkerchief or cloth nearby to clean one's private parts. Number eight is to avoid having intercourse with a breastfeeding woman. So whilst your wife is breastfeeding, it's highly discouraged to have intercourse with her. And number nine is to engage in excessive talk when making love. And again, this is based on a hadith which is not authentic, where the Prophet, peace be upon him, is reported to have said that do not talk whilst making love, because if you do, it will cause like the person to become dumb, or something along those lines. So that hadith is not authentic. It's actually more likely to be fabricated, but Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi still cited that like discouraged people from talking because in those days it was kind of considered to be something that wasn't befitting of a Muslim to engage in excessive talk. And again, it might be the case because people may overhear you, whether it's your children or neighbors nearby. So that's why it was discouraged to talk excessively. Whereas if one knows that people can't hear them, you're with your wife in a closed space, then by all means, inshallah, there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Number 10 is to recite a prayer after intercourse. So after one has ejaculated or climax or once finished their session, one should recite a prayer, especially after ejaculation, praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala after ejaculation for the blessing of intimacy and for potentially the blessing of offspring and thanking Allah for one's family. So the 10th recommended act is to say a prayer after intercourse. Number 11 is to perform ghusl. So it's not required, it's not wajib to perform ghusl, which is a ritual bath after one has intercourse, but it's recommended, especially before one sleeps. Now, again, it's not forbid. I mean, it's not compulsory. You just need to perform ghusl before the next prayer. So if, for example, you make love to your wife at the night, then obviously you need to wake up for Fajr. You can technically sleep and then do two ghusl before you pray Fajr. But it's encouraged that one should perform ghusl immediately after one has intercourse and ejaculates, because as we know, as I'm sure you are well aware of, that ghusl, the ritual washing, becomes compulsory um, when one ejaculates. So, when no, not when one ejaculates, sorry, after one ejaculates, if you and then you want to make prayer. So, in order to pray, if you've had sex, one needs to perform ghusl. The 12th is one should not enter one's marital home suddenly if you've been away on a journey, or if you've been away on a trip, or you've been away a long time. So you should give your wife time to groom herself and get ready for you. So, and this is based on a hadith where Jabir ibn Abdullah was a young companion at the time. He was on his way to see his new wife. He was in a hurry whilst him and the Prophet, peace be upon him, as well as some other companions, was coming back from a military expedition. And the Prophet, he first was asking why was he in a hurry, and he explained that he recently got married. And then the Prophet told him that he should wait until the sun has risen so that his wife can have some time to groom herself, to shave her private parts, to get ready for you. So this is again an example of the Prophet, peace be upon him, teaching Jabir, and by extension teaching the rest of us, that we should be considerate to the needs of our woman, our spouse, and to ensure that she has time to get herself ready. So it's not about just thinking about, yes, you're in need, you're excited, go straight into into the marital home to have relations with her. One should be considerate and think about maybe she's sleeping, and also she does maybe need some time to groom herself and get ready. So that's why Ibn al-Arabi discouraged going into the house at night, especially if you've been away for a long journey, for a long period of time, and she's not aware. And again, this was said in a time where they didn't have, like mobile phones, cell phones, where they can contact the wife. So it's not like nowadays where if a man has been away for a long period of time, but his wife is well aware of that, and he's obviously communicating with her over the phone, then that's different. It's a different matter. So yeah, they're the 12 recommended acts that Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi he laid out, who was a student of Imam al-Ghazali. These are the 12 Sunnas, the 12 highly recommended acts in relation to sex. I'll read them out again. Number one, a prayer before sex. Number two, foreplay. Number three, female orgasm. Number four, avoid qibla. Number five, avoid naked sex. Number six, avoid genital looking. Number seven, clean after sex. Number eight, avoid breastfeeding woman. Number nine, avoid excessive talking. Number 10, prayer after sex. Number 11, wash after sex. Number 12, do not enter suddenly at night. Shukran. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I look forward to speaking to you on the next session. And if you want to know more, please check out the other courses at eretologyinstitute.com. That's eretologyinstitute.com.